In the dead silence of a world gone mad, a single red light blinks with agonizing regularity. Each pulse is a morbid heartbeat in the tomb of Bunker Delta 17. Each flicker a stark reminder of Sergeant Michael Crane's solitary vigil. His voice, raw and weary, is a fragile thread cast into the void, hoping to snag on the frayed edges of humanity. He speaks not to the living world, for that world is gone, devoured by an unseen horror. He speaks into the dead air, across the ruins of what was once their nation, a desperate message in a bottle launched into an ocean of silence. Will anyone hear him? Can anyone still hear him? Is there anyone left to hear? Tonight, you are invited to listen to his tale, a chilling testament whispered from the depths of despair. But be warned, once you tune in, you may find yourself trapped in the echoing halls of Bunker Delta 17, alongside Sergeant Crane, listening to the whispers from beyond the steel door and realizing, with a bone-chilling certainty, that some stories never truly end. Official channels went silent 5 days ago, Sergeant Crane began, his voice rasping against the sterile microphone. He wasn't sure if it was day 5 or day 15. Time had become a fluid, meaningless concept in the suffocating confines of the bunker. Down here, beneath tons of earth and steel, the rhythms of the world above had dissolved into an unnerving stillness, broken only by the mechanical whine of the aging generator and the frantic beat of his own heart. Maybe longer. Time has lost its usual meaning down here. He was Sergeant Michael Crane, assigned to Bunker Station Delta 17. His designation, once a badge of purpose, now felt like a cruel joke. Delta 17, a forgotten outpost in a forgotten war. His original mission was simple enough: maintain communication lines, relay supply requests, transmit official updates from command. A cog in the vast machine of the military, ensuring the seamless flow of information. But the machine had broken down, ground to a halt by something no training manual had prepared them for. Command hasn't called in, he continued, the words hanging heavy in the confined space. My last direct order was an online text message. Stand by. Situation evolves. And then silence. He chuckled mirthlessly, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the control room. Situation evolves. Understatement of the century, wouldn't you say? He hoped this broadcast, this fragile tendril of sound, would find someone, anyone. If you're listening, he pleaded into the microphone, his voice taking on a desperate edge, you'll know you're not alone. And maybe I'll feel less alone too. Day 1, or so they called it, the day the world began to unravel, felt deceptively normal. The news channels, those ever-optimistic heralds of manufactured calm, mentioned an unknown illness spreading in several regions. The bulletins were measured, almost dismissive. Isolated incidents, they called them. Under control. Crane and his team, Corporal Fisher and Private Rhodes, exchanged knowing glances in the bunker's main control room. They'd seen this script before. The downplaying, the reassurances, the slow, creeping dread that always followed. We received a few coded messages about quarantines, Crane recounted, his voice taking on the flat, emotionless tone of official reports, a stark contrast to the tremor of fear that laced his personal reflections. Our job was to stand by, remain calm, and be prepared to relay further instructions. At first, it felt procedural, almost mundane. They tested the radio frequencies, inventoried their rations, enough for weeks, if they were frugal, and performed routine maintenance checks on the heavy steel doors. The bunker itself was unremarkable, functional but claustrophobic. A main control room dominated by the console with its blinking red light, cramped barracks for a dozen personnel, a small medical base smelling faintly of antiseptic and fear, and a supplies area stacked high with metal crates. A heavy steel entrance, sealed by 2 massive hinges that looked like the jaws of some subterranean beast, guarded them from the unknown. The generator, their lifeline, coughed and wheezed in the background, a constant, rattling presence that promised power, but also threatened imminent failure. Crane was on shift with Corporal Fisher and Private Rhodes. Fisher, with her perpetually furrowed brow and a no-nonsense attitude that belied a deep-seated anxiety, meticulously monitored comms, her fingers dancing across the dials, searching for any flicker of life on the silent airwaves. Rhodes, younger, quieter, with haunted eyes that seemed to see things no one else could, obsessively checked for new bulletins, his face pale and drawn. They joked about it at first, forced, brittle humor to mask the growing unease. Another drill, Fisher had quipped, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Or we'll be out of here soon, right? Rhodes had just nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the blank monitor. None of them truly believed it, not deep down. A primal fear, cold and insidious, was already taking root in the bunker's stale air. 3 days after the first veiled mentions of the illness, the situation outside fractured, shattering the illusion of control. The orders turned urgent, crackling with static and panic. A scrambled broadcast, barely intelligible, tore through the sterile quiet of the control room. It was a field commander, his voice strained, on the verge of breaking. Bunker Delta 17. Do you read? Do you read? The static hissed and spat, obscuring the words, amplifying the terror. The infection, spreading, casualties, high, requesting, immediate lockdown, protocol. The voice broke, choked by static and something else, something darker. Prepare, potential infiltration, and then, just static. Empty, hissing static. Fisher's hand flew to the controls, frantically trying to boost the signal, to get a location, any details, anything to make sense of the fragmented message. But all they heard was the deafening hiss of empty air, a chilling void where a human voice, a cry for help, had just been. Then, with a thunderous clang that resonated through the bunker's steel core, the entrance slammed shut. Automated security protocol. Initiated. No human command, just cold, unfeeling machinery sealing them off from the world. That was the moment. The moment everything shifted, fractured, and reality reformed into something monstrous and unrecognizable. That was the moment the joke died. The perimeter cameras, grainy and flickering, flickered to life on the small monitor. They cycled through the feeds, their breath catching in their throats. People, gathering outside the chain-link fence that surrounded the facility, but not people as they knew them. Some stumbled, their movements jerky, unnatural. Some ran with a horrifying, single-minded purpose, limbs flailing, faces contorted in silent screams. Most just stood there, swaying, disoriented, like puppets with broken strings. Their eyes, even in the low-resolution feed, seemed vacant, devoid of life, reflecting only the cold, unblinking gaze of the camera. Then, the feed cut out. Blank static filled the screen. Silent, absolute silence descended on the control room. No one spoke. Crane, Fisher, Rhodes, 3 figures frozen in tableau, staring at the static, each grappling with the same dawning, horrific realization. Their world, the world they knew, was gone. Forever. In the days that followed, they clung to structure, to routine, like drowning men to a piece of driftwood. That's what they drilled into you in training. Keep calm. Follow procedure. Stick to a schedule. Discipline in the face of chaos. A futile, yet deeply human, attempt to impose order on the encroaching madness. 7 a.m. Wake up in the cramped, stale-aired barracks. 7:30 a.m. Eat breakfast together, tasteless ration bars chewed in silence, punctuated by the generator's groaning symphony. 8 a.m. Check external sensors, scan frequencies, the radio a constant source of empty static and gnawing disappointment. 9 a.m. Inspect the generator and fuel supply, watching the gauges with increasing anxiety. 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Rotate shifts, a rigid schedule of rest, restless, dream-haunted sleep, exercise, stiff, joyless movements in the confined barracks, and overwatch on the cameras, now showing only static, a blank, mocking void. They repeated these steps day in and day out, a hollow pantomime of normalcy in a world that had ceased to be normal. Even without contact from above, without purpose, without hope, the routine felt comforting, a fragile shield against the rising tide of fear. The only problem, the crushing, inescapable problem, was the silence. As they obsessively scanned frequencies, The airwaves remained utterly, terrifyingly quiet. Occasionally, a faint burst of static would crackle to life, a phantom whisper that momentarily ignited a desperate spark of hope. Maybe that was a voice? But it always faded, dissolving back into the oppressive silence, leaving them with a deeper, more profound sense of isolation. Maybe they got it under control up there, Corporal Fisher offered one evening, attempting to inject some optimism into the suffocating gloom. We'll get a call soon. She smiled, a weak, strained smile that failed to reach her fear-widened eyes. Crane nodded, offering a hollow echo of agreement, but the words felt like ashes in his mouth. Rhodes remained silent, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror in the middle distance. One evening, as the bunker settled into the uneasy quiet of night, a new sound reached them. Soft, tentative, scraping on the thick metal door at the end of the corridor. The blood drained from Crane's face. Fisher froze, her hand hovering over the radio dial. Rhodes, who had been pacing restlessly, stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. The scraping continued, a slow, rhythmic drag across the steel, punctuated by occasional muffled thuds, as if something was pressing against the door, testing its strength, its resilience. For half an hour, they stood there, motionless, suspended in a tableau of fear, listening to the relentless, unsettling sound. No one spoke. The generator's whine seemed to amplify the silence around the scraping, making it feel even more intrusive, more menacing. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. An unnerving silence descended, heavier, more oppressive than before. Private Rhodes, his face pale, his eyes wide and darting, grabbed his rifle, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He crept towards the door, his boots muffled on the steel floor, a silhouette moving through the dimly lit corridor. He pressed an ear against the cold metal, listening intently, his breath held tight in his lungs. After a long, agonizing moment, he turned back, shaking his head slowly. "Nothing," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Nothing there." They checked the security feed from the small external camera near the entrance. The camera showed partial darkness, broken only by the flickering overhead lamp, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and shifted with the unreliable light. No movement. Nothing but darkness and shadows. They rationalized it, desperately clinging to logic in the face of the inexplicable. Debris, they told themselves. Maybe an animal, disoriented, lost. Deep down, however, in the cold, dark places of their minds, they suspected it was neither. It was something else, something waiting. 2 days later, a new, more tangible problem arose. The water pressure began fluctuating erratically, sputtering and coughing through the pipes, a disconcerting prelude to complete failure. Then, the generator, their lifeblood, began to falter. Its power output occasionally dipped, causing the lights to flicker ominously, plunging sections of the bunker into brief, terrifying darkness. The bunker was designed to operate independently, yes, but only if the maintenance crew on the outside could periodically restock the fuel tanks, replenish water supplies, perform essential repairs. Now, there was no outside. There was only the bunker, and whatever was beyond those steel doors. Conservation became paramount. They shut off lights in unused corridors, plunging them into an echoing, oppressive darkness. They limited non-essential equipment, rationing power, rationing hope. But the real problem, the insidious, corrosive problem, was morale. With the world above seemingly devoured, every conversation turned dark, every thought spiraled downwards into despair. Fisher, bless her stubborn heart, tried to keep spirits up, forcing cheerfulness, telling jokes that fell flat in the heavy air. But even her optimism was fraying at the edges, the strain etched deep into her face. Rhodes, already quiet and withdrawn, retreated further into himself, becoming almost spectral. He spent hours in the hallway by the door, listening, always listening, for any sound from the other side. Crane sometimes heard him whispering in the darkness, his voice a low, broken murmur. "We can't be alone down here. We can't be alone." Crane threw himself into his role as radio operator, a desperate attempt to find purpose in the deepening abyss. He scanned every frequency he could find, obsessively, frantically, searching for any sign of life, any voice in the void. Every so often, a faint crackle, a burst of static, would trick him, ignite a flicker of irrational hope, make his heart leap in his chest. Someone was about to speak. Someone was out there. But nothing ever came through. Just static. Endless, mocking static. It was like standing in a vast, pitch-black room, waiting for a light switch to click on, knowing, with a sickening certainty, that the power was cut, that the lights would never come on again. On what Crane believed was their 12th day in lockdown, time was losing all definition, days bled into nights, routines blurred. He picked up something strange. Over an old military frequency, buried deep in the static hiss, a faint sound, almost inaudible. A voice? If anyone listening, the words were fragmented, swallowed by static, but undeniably human. Help, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the signal faded back into nothingness. Silence. Only the whispering static remained. Crane shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins, hope, raw, electrifying hope, exploding within him. Fisher. Rhodes. Did you hear that? Did you hear it? He fumbled with the dials, his hands shaking, trying to lock onto the frequency, to transmit. This is Delta 17. We read you. Please repeat. Please repeat. Silence. Only the mocking static answered his frantic calls. No response. Nothing. That night, Crane barely slept. He replayed the short burst of audio over and over in his mind, clinging to it like a lifeline. If anyone, listening, help, was it a man's voice? A woman's? Were they close? Distant? He couldn't tell. But it gave him a flicker of hope, a fragile, precious spark in the encroaching darkness. Someone was still out there. Someone was alive. The next night, the scraping returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent. Crane was on watch, his eyes glued to the monitor, the red light blinking in his periphery like a malevolent eye. Slow, repetitive drag across the steel, edging closer, more deliberate. He called out for Rhodes and Fisher, his voice tight with fear, his heart pounding against his ribs. They rushed into the control room, their faces pale in the flickering light. Crane pointed to the monitor, his hand trembling. They checked the external camera feed, their breath catching in their throats. For a moment, Crane thought the camera was broken, or covered in dust. The view was obscured, smudged, blurry. But then, they saw it. A hand, pressed against the lens, fingers splayed, smearing the view, a grotesque, silent plea. A person, standing directly in front of the door, staring into the camera, into their bunker. They couldn't see their face clearly, only the ragged outlines of their uniform, the way they tilted their head, listening, perhaps, for any sound from within. Rhodes grabbed his rifle, his eyes burning with a strange, feverish intensity. "We should let them in," he insisted, his voice low, urgent. "That could be one of ours." Fisher hesitated, her brow furrowed, her gaze darting between the monitor and Rhodes. "We have orders to maintain quarantine, Rhodes. Strict orders. We don't know if they're infected." Her voice was strained, wavering between fear and protocol. The hand slid down the camera lens, leaving a long, greasy streak, obscuring the view even further. They watched as the figure slumped, vanishing from the frame, falling out of sight. The scraping continued for a few more minutes, then faded, finally ceasing. The silence returned, heavier, more oppressive than ever. No one slept well that night. The image of that hand, pressed against the camera lens, the ragged uniform, the slumped figure, was burned into their minds, a chilling reminder of what waited beyond the steel doors. In the days that followed, they tried to pretend that encounter had never happened, to push it to the back of their minds, to bury it under the weight of routine. They stuck to their schedule, the rigid structure of their days, but it felt more hollow each day, more like a charade. The supply inventory, though dwindling, was still decent enough for several weeks, if they continued rationing. But the real worry, The ever-present dread was water and power. The generator coughed and sputtered with increasing frequency, making terrifying noises as if it might fail completely at any moment. Fisher suggested a controlled reset of the generator. It would require shutting everything down, plunging the bunker into darkness and silence. For a short period, they didn't like the idea of being without lights, air filtration, communications, even briefly. It felt too risky, too vulnerable. But they agreed, grudgingly, that it was necessary. A gamble they had to take. The plan was to do it first thing in the morning, a calculated risk, a desperate attempt to keep their fragile sanctuary operational. That morning, with heavy hearts and trembling hands, they turned off the main breakers. Darkness descended, absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence was immediate, profound, oppressive. The generator's whine ceased abruptly, leaving a vacuum of sound, broken only by the sound of their own breathing, ragged and shallow in the stale air. Even though it lasted mere minutes, perhaps only seconds, the darkness stretched on, infinite, eternal. Time itself seemed to warp and distort in the absence of light. When the lights flickered back to life, weak and wavering at first, then gradually strengthening, Crane felt a profound sense of relief, a physical loosening of the knot of fear in his chest. He hurried to the console, his fingers fumbling with the controls, reactivating the radio, scanning for signals. At first, everything was routine. Static on every channel, no immediate changes. Then, the motion sensor alert flashed red. Unexpected, jarring. Red in the dim, flickering light. They checked the hallway camera near the door, their hearts hammering in their chests. Two figures stood there. This time, both of them. Both wearing tattered, familiar uniforms. One reached up to the camera lens again, the same gesture, the same haunting plea, as if they knew, somehow, that they were being watched. Fisher breathed out, a shaky, almost inaudible whisper. "They're wearing our insignia." Crane stared at the grainy feed, his stomach twisting into a cold knot. He couldn't tell for sure through the static-ridden image, but he felt a hollow chill settle deep in his bones. It was them. It was their comrades, or what was left of them. They braced themselves for more scraping, more pounding, the relentless assault on their steel sanctuary. But instead, they heard something else. Voices. Faint, barely audible, as though carried through a vent or a crack in the bunker structure, whispering from beyond the steel walls. Hushed conversation, unintelligible, yet undeniably present. Rhodes pressed his ear against the corridor wall, his eyes widening in disbelief and dawning terror. "They're talking," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his breath clouding in the stale air. "They're trying to talk to us." Panic, raw and visceral, finally broke through the carefully constructed wall of routine. Should they open the door? Should they retreat deeper into the bunker, sealing themselves off completely, abandoning all hope of rescue, all vestiges of humanity? Fisher, her voice trembling, her hands shaking, tried to hail them on the external intercom. "This is Bunker Delta 17, she called out, her voice cracking with fear and desperation. "If you can understand me, please identify yourselves." No response crackled from the speaker. Silence. But the faint voices continued, just beyond the walls, too soft, too indistinct to discern, yet undeniably there, whispering secrets in the darkness. That night, as the unsettling whispers continued just beyond the walls, Crane picked up another broadcast, even fainter than before, almost swallowed by the static. Fragmented words, broken syllables carried on the dying breath of the airwaves. Extraction, not safe, hold out, as long as can, and then silence again. The signal died, leaving only the mocking hiss of static. Crane repeated the words into the microphone, his voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. "Say again, please. This is Sergeant Michael Crane at Delta 17. We need assistance. Over." No reply came back. Nothing. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe it was just static playing tricks on his frayed nerves. Or maybe whoever sent that message, whoever was still out there, no longer had the equipment to respond. Or worse. Still, he clung to those broken syllables. Extraction. Hold out. There was some hope, right? A flicker, however faint, in the encroaching darkness. The next morning, Rhodes marched to the door, his movements stiff, his eyes fixed, a grim determination hardening his features. "I'm opening it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They might be from command, or survivors. We can't leave them out there." Fisher and Crane argued, their voices rising in panicked protest. They pointed out the potential danger of infection, the strict orders to stay sealed, the very real possibility that they would lose the bunker entirely if they let the outside in. Rhodes wouldn't listen. He was past logic, past reason, driven by a desperate need to act, to break the suffocating isolation. He said he could at least speak with them through the partial locking mechanism in the antechamber, the small space between the inner and outer doors. Against their better judgment, against their training, against their deepest instincts, they agreed on a compromise. A desperate, reckless compromise. They would open the inner door of the two-door system, keeping the outer door sealed, creating a narrow, contained space. Rhodes could attempt communication from within the relative safety of the bunker. If the unknown individuals seemed safe, if they were truly survivors, then they could reevaluate. Using the manual override, their hands shaking, their hearts pounding in their chests, they opened the inner door. The thick steel groaned and shrieked as it slid open, revealing a dimly lit chamber, a claustrophobic antechamber between the inner and outer doors. The outer door was still locked, still sealed, their last barrier against the unknown. But they could see them now. Two silhouettes pressed against the reinforced outer door, their forms distorted by the thick glass viewport, their outlines shifting in the dim light. Rhodes called out, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Identify yourselves." They reacted. The silhouettes shifted, their forms jerking, as if they heard him clearly, as if his voice had pierced the steel barrier. One of them seemed to mouth words, their lips moving in slow, unnatural motions. But no sound reached them through the reinforced door. Silence. Only the faint, unsettling whispers, still emanating from somewhere beyond the walls. Then, with startling, horrifying speed, the silhouettes began pounding on the metal. Not human pounding, not rational, violent, desperate, rhythmic. Their movements looked unnatural, jerky, driven by something beyond desperation, something worse. Rhodes stepped back, his face white, his eyes wide with stark terror. "Close it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Close it now." They slammed the inner door shut, their muscles screaming, their hands fumbling with the locking mechanism, securing it with trembling hands. The pounding on the outer door continued, echoing through the bunker, a deafening, rhythmic assault that seemed to vibrate through their bones. For hours, the relentless pounding echoed through the bunker, a terrifying symphony of desperation and something far more sinister. Then, slowly, gradually, it faded and stopped. After that, Rhodes hardly spoke. He moved through the bunker like a ghost, his eyes vacant, his face a mask of numb terror. Fisher became more diligent, more focused on procedure, rechecking systems, triple-checking ration counts, as if by sheer force of will, she could hold back the encroaching darkness. She no longer joked about going home soon. Crane could see the fear in her eyes, a silent, grim acceptance that this might be their new reality. Forever. Time blurred again. Days and nights indistinguishable, bleeding into one another in a monotonous cycle of fear and routine. They attempted to maintain their schedule, but each passing day felt heavier, more hollow, more pointless. The lights flickered more often, more erratically, plunging the bunker into momentary blackouts that stretched their nerves to the breaking point. Every beep from the bunker sensors, every creak of the aging structure, made them jump, their hearts leaping in their chests. No further signals came in through the radio, just background static, a never-ending hiss that filled the silence and gnawed at their sanity. They took turns sleeping in the control room, unwilling to stray too far from each other, unwilling to be alone in the encroaching darkness. None of them wanted to be alone anymore. Eventually, inevitably, the generator's condition became critical. One evening, The lights dimmed so low they could barely see, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed in the gloom. The fans slowed, making the air thick, stale, suffocating. They scrambled to keep the power going, rerouting what little fuel they had left, performing desperate, futile maintenance in the dying light. Despite their efforts, they knew they were running on borrowed time. At the same moment, as the lights flickered and died again, an alarm beeped urgently on the console, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the oppressive silence. Exterior tampering. Potential breach. Their blood ran cold. They switched on the external cameras, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding in their chests. The lens was covered by what looked like a hand. Again, but this time, multiple hands. Smeared, grotesque, reaching, clawing at the lens, obscuring the view. Silhouettes moved around the entrance, a writhing mass of distorted shapes in the grainy feed. The pounding returned, steady, methodical, relentless, as though they were trying to break through, as though they were no longer content to just whisper. That night, in the dying light of the flickering lamps, Crane made another broadcast. His voice trembled, but he tried to maintain a semblance of professionalism, to cling to the fading vestiges of his training. "This is Sergeant Michael Crane of Bunker Delta 17, he began, his voice cracking, broadcasting on all frequencies. "Our power is nearly depleted. We have limited rations. If anyone is out there, we request instructions, assistance, or any confirmation of activity. Please respond." He repeated variations of that message for what felt like hours, his voice growing hoarse, his hope fading with each passing moment. But the radio remained silent, just static, the never-ending hiss of the void. A creeping dread settled in his mind, a cold, heavy certainty that squeezed the air from his lungs. They were alone, truly alone. The next day, in a desperate attempt to find some alternative, some escape route, they discovered a small hatch in the maintenance corridor. According to the bunker schematic, it led to an underground service route, a forgotten tunnel system perhaps designed for emergency repairs to power lines or a hidden supply pathway. Fisher and Rhodes debated whether they should open it. Some part of them, the rational, terrified part, feared it might lead to a worse fate, a deeper, more inescapable trap. Another part, the desperate, grasping at straws part, felt it was their only chance to escape, their last, desperate gamble. If the main door was compromised, in the end, fear won. They sealed the hatch from their side, welding it shut with trembling hands, and decided not to venture down into the unknown darkness below. They told themselves they still had a chance to be rescued here, in the relative safety of the bunker. Leaving felt like an even greater gamble. But Crane couldn't shake the feeling, the gnawing, insidious feeling, that they might be making a fatal mistake by staying put. On what he believed was their 20th or 30th day, time was a meaningless blur. Crane got one final burst of radio chatter. It was garbled beyond recognition, distorted by static and interference, but there were words in it. Someone was definitely speaking. He caught only 2 phrases before the transmission abruptly cut out, swallowed by silence. Containment breach. Bravo sector. Lost all units. Retrieve. No further contact. And then, just silence. Final, absolute silence. It sounded like all hope of containment had failed. If Bravo sector was gone, that likely meant the entire network of bunkers, the entire system of safe zones, was compromised. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. As days, or what felt like days, went by, the scraping, pounding, and whispering around their bunker walls grew more frequent, more insistent, more menacing. It was as if more of them had gathered, a growing horde, all trying to get in, their numbers swelling, their desperation intensifying. Sometimes they heard them right behind the steel door, their muffled movements sending shivers down their spines. Sometimes around the ventilation shafts, whispers carried on the stale, recycled air. Once or twice, it sounded like they were trying to speak actual words, coherent sentences, but the tones were strange, guttural, unsettling, like a corrupted language, a mockery of human speech. Rhodes, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt, began to talk about going outside again. in one desperate, suicidal mission to secure the perimeter, to find out what was really out there. Fisher, her voice weary, her spirit broken, reminded him that they had no knowledge of how many were out there, what they were facing. Their cameras showed only shadows, fleeting glimpses of tattered uniforms, distorted figures moving in the darkness. They'd all witnessed how quickly they could move, how tireless they seemed, how relentlessly they kept returning, drawn to the bunker like moths to a dying flame. The generator was failing more often now, its sputtering coughs becoming more frequent, more violent, closer to a complete collapse. The lights flickered so frequently, so erratically, that sometimes Crane couldn't tell if he was staring into his own reflection in the darkness, or if he was seeing movement in the corner of his eye, shapes shifting in the periphery. The air in the bunker felt heavy, thick, stale, each breath a labored effort. Fisher, ever practical, ever resourceful, tried to set up a manual crank for the radio system, a last-ditch effort, a futile attempt to maintain some semblance of communication after the generator finally died. But it was only a temporary solution, a fragile bridge across an abyss. Every time the lights went out completely, plunged into absolute, impenetrable blackness, the bunker's interior became a black void, disorienting, terrifying. "We can't keep living like this indefinitely," Crane whispered to the microphone, his voice barely audible above the generator's wheezing cough and the faint, unsettling whispers just beyond the walls. He'd been broadcasting as often as he could, telling their story, casting his voice into the empty airwaves, a desperate message in a bottle tossed into a bottomless ocean of silence. He kept hoping, irrationally, against all logic, that someone would hear their call, that a miracle would happen. But with each passing hour, that hope waned, flickering like the dying lights of the bunker. Sometimes, in the long, silent hours, he wondered if anyone was even out there to listen now. If humanity hadn't been completely swallowed by the darkness. Now, as he dictated this message, his last testament, perhaps, the faint pounding on the door continued, a relentless, rhythmic pulse that echoed through the bunker. It never truly went away. At times, it sounded like they were trying to speak, those guttural, unsettling tones just beyond the steel walls. Crane wasn't sure he wanted to know what they were saying, or if they even understood them at all. Fisher was in the corridor, making another desperate attempt to brace the door, reinforcing it with whatever scraps of metal she could find, a futile effort against an unseen, relentless force. Rhodes was near the hatch, staring at it with a haunted, desperate gaze, like he was about to open it, to plunge into the unknown darkness below, and never look back. Crane sat at the console, the red light blinking in his periphery, a morbid pulse in the dying silence, broadcasting to whomever might still care, to the empty airwaves, to the void. "Our supplies won't last forever," he whispered into the microphone. "The generator might fail any minute." And the whispers outside are growing louder. "If you're listening," he pleaded, his voice breaking, "if you're somehow picking up my voice, please stay safe. Use caution if you try to reach us. I can't promise you'll find anything but darkness and echoing halls when you arrive. But we're here, still holding on. For now, no official rescue team has shown up. No new orders have come. And each hour, the chance of a miracle fades. But we're not giving up. Not yet. This is Sergeant Michael Crane, Bunker Delta 17, signing off. At least, until the next broadcast. The transmission ends. Silence descends again, heavier, more profound than before. And in that quiet, the red light on the console stops blinking. The radio, once the last link to the outside world, goes still. Faint footsteps echo beyond the sealed corridor, joined by distant, halting voices, whispering just beyond the steel walls. Whether they are friend or foe, rescue or oblivion, remains unknown. The only certain thing is that Bunker Delta 17 still stands, hidden from the world above, waiting in the silence. Somewhere in the darkness, Sergeant Michael Crane keeps watch, hoping for a sign, or a knock that won't be followed by fear. Thank you for listening. If your heart raced, even a little, be sure to like and subscribe for more eerie narratives. Your support is what keeps this channel alive. Until next time, stay vigilant, and remember, curiosity can be quite the companion, and sometimes a curse. What chills me most about Sergeant Crane's tale is the suffocating isolation, the slow descent into despair, the chilling realization that hope itself can become a torment. The whispers from beyond the door. What are they? Who are they? And what will happen when Bunker Delta 17 finally falls silent, for good? If you want to delve deeper into the darkness of Bunker Delta 17, let me know in the comments below. Should we venture back into the bunker in part 2? Should we uncover the secrets of the whispers, or the fate of Sergeant Crane, Fisher, and Rhodes? Your likes, subs, and comments will decide if we continue this terrifying journey together. Tell me what you think, and until then, sleep tight, if you can.